In our last episode of Lest We Forget, Miller's followers were not the only ones to study the prophecies and the return of Christ. Outside the United States, in other parts of the world, other men were motivated to decipher the Bible prophecies and allow them to challenge their presuppositions.
Manuel Cunza, born in 1731 in Santiago, Chile. In 1747, at the age of 16, he was admitted on probation to the Jesuit order. After completing his 2-year vow, he studied philosophy, theology, and graduated with honors. He was given the instructional and spiritual supervision of younger students, but he was still too restive. That wasn't enough to keep him out of mischief. Keep him busy, because he had a very active mind and a very bright mind. And so they made him a professor of Latin. He also pursued studies in astronomy and geometry. In 1766, he took the 4 vows to become a Jesuit. Then in 1767, as was mentioned in the worship, he was expelled from Chile by King Charles III of Spain, who ordered that all the Jesuits in all of his New World possessions, all the way from Mexico clear to the southern tip of South America, all of them were expelled from the New World. He discovered 2 comings of Christ, one resurrection before the millennium, when the righteous dead will be raised, and then another resurrection at the end of the millennium. Unlike the view of Daniel Whitby, then held by most Catholics and Protestants, that the earth would get better for 1,000 years, and then Christ would come. Lacunza also discovered that there are 2 judgments depicted in Scripture, separated by much time. A couple of things that really got him into trouble. One is he discovered that the Antichrist was not an individual, such as the church was teaching at that time. There are differing views. Some thought it was Wycliffe, some thought it was Martin Luther, but somebody was going to be the Antichrist that would come harass the church. Not according to what Lacunza's conclusions were after his study. He came to the conclusion that the Antichrist was really a great moral body of apostasy that displayed characteristics of the Roman Catholic Church, of which he was a part. That got him into trouble, as you might imagine, but it gets worse than that. He also discovered that the second beast of Revelation 13 and the harlot of Revelation 17 displayed characteristics of the Roman Catholic priesthood, of which he was a member.
Manuel Lacunza published a book with his ideas. It was quickly banned by the church. But before long, it had arrived in England and was translated in the Ackerman edition, then later read and translated by Edward Irving, a famous Scottish Presbyterian preacher.
He's Edward Irving, a Scottish Presbyterian minister who was then preaching in London to packed audiences. In fact, his church services were so packed that by the wealthy of London that you had to have a ticket to get into his church services. Lacunza's work had a very great impact on the British Advent Awakening movement of the 1820s and 1830s. Now, not all of Lacunza's conclusions were borne out through later study, but he was used by God to focus people's attention, including Roman Catholics and even Jesuits, on Daniel and Revelation.
On the one side, Manuel Lacunza, a Jesuit convicted by Bible truth. On another side, a man of very different origins, but equally moved by the conviction that comes from the knowledge of the truth. A converted Jew named Joseph Wolf.
He was born in 1795 in Bavaria. He was raised in Prussia. His father, David Wolf, was an Orthodox Jewish rabbi. So now to get someone studying about the return of Christ who was the son of an Orthodox Jewish rabbi, well, God again had a challenge.
As a child, he was challenged by his neighbor to learn more about Jesus. Studying the Bible, he was baptized as a Christian. As an adult, he became a missionary in the Middle East and impacted Europe as well, preaching about the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation in 14 different languages.
The full force of the preaching of the first angel's message was going on around the world, and Joseph Wolf was part of it. In the United States and Canada, it's the Millerite movement. In Europe and Africa and throughout the Middle East, it's Wolf and others. In Calcutta, India, the Bishop of Calcutta, Daniel Wilson, was preaching and writing on the prophecies of Daniel. Out in Adelaide, Australia, Thomas Playford was also preaching on the prophecies all at the same time as the beginnings of the Millerite movement or the Adventist movement here in North America, out of which our church eventually emerged.
Today we will learn the story of a sea captain who found Jesus in the middle of the ocean and ended up becoming a pioneer of the Seventh-day Adventist movement. The 6th episode of Lest We Forget starts now. Every now and again, you run into a person whose life is stranger than fiction. In this episode, we will be exploring the life of a man whose story is full of colorful twists and turns. He was many things: a sailor, health reformer, preacher, missionary, and writer, to name a few. He was a man of deep integrity who connected believing with doing. Joseph Bates' story is inspiring and challenging.
Welcome to Joseph Bates country. This is where Bates grew up, in this area. This is the Acushnet River, and on that side of the river is New Bedford. This side where we're standing is Fairhaven. Originally, it was all one city. However, at the time of the War of 1812, there was a difference of opinion between the merchants that primarily were on that side of the river in what's now New Bedford, who were a little more pro-British because of their business interests, and the citizens on this side. So the two cities separated. And ever since, this has been the city of Fairhaven, and that's New Bedford. In the 1820s, 30s, well, even earlier than that, the Bates family moved here in 1793 when Joseph was a year old. He was actually born July 8, 1792, and his father, who was a businessman, also named Joseph Bates, moved the family here in 1793. So Bates was about a year old. Now Joseph Bates, as a young boy, wanted to go to sea. New Bedford soon became the whaling capital of the United States. By the 1820s or so, there were more whaling vessels coming in and out of this harbor than all of the other harbors combined in the United States. So Bates grew up in this area with all of these ships coming in from all ports of the world. And as a young man, he wanted to go to sea. His father had no interest in him going to sea because in those days, seamen would often be gone anywhere from 6 months to a year or two, and many of them were lost at sea and never came back. So his father did not want his son going to sea, but Joseph insisted that he wanted to go to sea. So in 1807, his father arranged with a captain to take Joseph on a voyage to Europe, and thinking for sure that's going to get it out of the system of this young kid. If I can get him to Europe and back, why, that will be the end of his wanting to go to sea. He goes to sea, and he will now become very interested in the sea, and it will be the major component of his life for the next 21 years. During that period of time, he's impressed into the British Navy as a precursor to the War of 1812 between Britain and the United States, when our country got tired of the British, thinking that we were still a colony of theirs and that they could still do whatever they wanted with our seamen and our vessels and all. And so we went to war with Britain, and Bates was in that. He was caught in the middle of that, served as a prisoner of war, came back home in 1815 after the war had ended. he's not home very long, and he is off to sea again. And that's the pattern. Come home, be home a very short time, and off to sea again. He does come home in 1818, long enough to get married to his childhood sweetheart, who was the daughter of a captain, so she knew what she was getting into when she married Joseph. But he's off to sea again, and he continues going off to sea. Many of his voyages after the War of 1812 were to Brazil, and he spent several years, one time about 2 years, down traveling back and forth in Brazil. But he goes clear down around the Horn on one trip. He makes it clear up to Peru on the other side of South America. So he's spending a lot of time in South America sailing back and forth.
Joseph Bates was a man who lived a very colorful life. Born in 1792, while still a baby, his family moved to Fairhaven, Massachusetts, just a bridge away from New Bedford, which would become the whaling capital of the United States. There, Joseph grew up, longing to go to sea. In 1807, he began his first sea voyage. On that first trip, he was just a cabin boy.
Now, a little bit about Bates himself. Joseph Bates was a very colorful individual. He was born in 1792, and when he was about a year of age, the family moved from Rochester, Massachusetts, a few miles to New Bedford, and that's where he grew up, and in 1807 he went to sea. On that first trip, he was just a cabin boy, and so he was the lowest of anybody on the ship, and he was told to go up in the crow's nest and look around, and he fell into the sea. And so, of course, they threw a rope out to catch him, pull him ashore, and when he got ashore, why, somebody said, "Where's a shark?" There had been a big shark following the ship, and he never even thought about it when he fell off, lost his footing and fell into the ocean until afterwards, and then he shakes, all of a sudden they realize this shark could have eaten him alive if it had turned and moved over to the other side of the ship. And of course, looking back on it, I think it was providential that God got Mr. Shark to move to the other side of the ship instead of having Bates for lunch that day, or whatever meal it would have been for that shark. Now, Americans were not too excited about the accommodations that their fine king provided for his prisoners. And the Americans found themselves in the hold, down in the bottom of an old former British warship that was now anchored off the coast of England. It was no longer seaworthy in terms of fighting, but it still hadn't quite sunk. So it was being where they were imprisoning these Americans. Bates, who had a very independent streak in him, and some of his friends, decided that they didn't appreciate the accommodations of the king, and so they were going to try to escape. And they started working on cutting a hole in the side of this wood-hulled ship. Now, they could only do it for a short period of time, because if they made too much noise, why, obviously the guards up on the deck would find out what was going on. But slowly they worked away, and they didn't have many tools to use either, but they slowly worked away, cutting a hole in the side of the ship. Finally, it came to the night when they thought that they would be able to remove the planking and some of them escaped through this hole that they had been cutting in the side of the ship. Now, there were a couple of other American prisoners who were drunk most of the time, and they demanded that they be allowed to leave the ship first. And if they didn't, if they were not allowed, even though they had not been part of cutting the hole in the side of the ship, if they were not allowed to leave first, they would make a great big noise to everybody and let the soldiers, the guards up above, would know that there was an escape on, and so then everybody would be in trouble. So Bates was not the leader, but he was in on the ring that was cutting the hole in the side of the ship. So they all talked amongst themselves what they were going to do, and they finally realized that these two guys were serious. If they didn't let them go first, they would make a commotion, and the whole thing would be off. So they asked the two guys, "Can you swim?" "Oh, yes, we can swim." So here they were. They let them out. Well, these two guys who were nicely inebriated, when they hit the cold water, all of a sudden they realized they couldn't swim, and they're flailing around out there, making a noise. Of course, the guards up on the deck realize that there's an escape on, and they come rushing down into the hold of the ship. Now, Bates and the others that were the ones that actually cut the hole in the side of the ship, they figured this is what was going to happen. So they all retreated to the other side of the ship. So when the guards come down, of course, they're all total innocents. They know nothing about this escape. It's all these two guys. They're the only ones that were involved with all this. However, Bates, of course, then the British, the guards, they realize they've got this escape going on. So they bring in a crew to patch the side of the ship. While they're pounding away to make a patch for the ship, while Bates and his friends are in the back of the wood ship starting to cut the next hole in the side of the ship. What I'm trying to tell you is Bates was not one that was ever just a status quo man. He's always figuring something or other. Now, when he gets to Dartmoor prison, that had stone walls and all that. It wasn't quite so easy to cut holes in the side. But Bates was always a man on the go. He was always trying to do something innovative. He was always doing something different.
Up until that point in his life, Joseph Bates was not a religious man. That is, until one of his trips in 1824. His wife, who was a Christian, put a New Testament in her husband's trunk. He found the book and read it throughout the trip. That, along with the death of one of his seamen, caused him to think very deeply about spiritual matters, and he gave his life to Jesus. When he returned home, he made the decision to join his wife's church.
He had already decided just by giving up strong drink, he worked better. I mean, his body worked better. So in 1821, he quit using grog or strong drink. In 1822, he discarded the use of wine. 1824, he cut out all alcohol, beer, and even fermented cider. It's also in 1824 that his wife now puts the Bible in his trunk. And so he, on that voyage, finds the Bible and finds the Lord. Later on that same year, he discarded the use of tobacco, so he quit smoking. When he comes home in 1827, he joins the Christian Connection Church that his wife is a member of. He hasn't built the church that we show, but he joined her congregation. Actually, at that point, the congregation was meeting in the Fairhaven Academy. Up on the top floor was a big open room, and that's where that church met for a number of years. 1837, he discarded the use of tea and coffee. 1843, he quit eating meat. Also in 1843, he discarded butter, cheese, pies, and cakes. So you may be wondering, well, what was he eating at that point? Because there was no, pre-made vegetarian foods in those days. Well, he ate vegetables and that kind of thing. So Bates has become a health reformer long before Ellen White is given her vision on health in 1863. As a result, Bates is the healthiest of the whole bunch. He is older, he's a generation older. I mean, he was born in 1792, James White was born in 1821, but he is the healthiest of the bunch. When they all break down, and the whole General Conference Committee, all 3 or 4 or 5 of them, whatever it was then, had to go to Dansville in New York to get their health back, the only one that was left to run the church was Joseph Bates. And he was, as I say, a generation older.
Although Joseph Bates' time as a sea captain allowed him to retire as a relatively wealthy man, after he became involved with the Millerite movement, he began to funnel all of his resources into spreading the gospel. By 1844, he and his wife no longer owned their own home. They had had to sell their home on Mulberry Street so that they could further fund the work. After 1844, as the Bates were living with the Bunkers, they were working on tracts. Joseph Bates would write 3 tracts regarding the Sabbath here. His first edition of the Seventh-day Sabbath, a Perpetual Sign, in 1846, his second edition in 47, and then a third tract, The Vindication of the Seventh-day Sabbath. At some point during this time, his funds had run very low. He had gotten down to the point where he only had a single York shilling, which was worth about 12.5 cents. He hadn't let his wife in on their severe financial hardships, however. So one day, Prudy came up to him and said, "Joseph, I need you to go to the store and get me 4 pounds of flour and some other items." Joseph Bates said, "Okay." So he went to the store and he got exactly 4 pounds of flour, plus the additional items his wife had needed. When he returned home, his wife said, "Have you, the Captain Bates who sailed the seas out of New Bedford, gone to the store and returned with only 4 pounds of flour? Joseph Bates said, "I have just spent the last money I have in this world on these items you requested." Prudy began to be very concerned, and she said, "What are we going to do?" Joseph Bates said, "The Lord will open a way." And she said, "That's what you always say." And as the story goes, she went off to have a good cry, and Joseph Bates went back to work on his tract. While he was working, he received an impression that he should go to the postman and see if there was any mail for him. When he got there, the postman, Mr. Drew, told him that he did indeed have a letter, but there were 5 cents postage due on it. Joseph Bates was penniless. The postman said, "That's okay, I know you're a man of integrity. Take the letter and pay me back later." But Joseph Bates refused to do it. He instead asked that the postman would open the letter to see if there was anything inside. When he opened the letter, there was $10 inside, with a note saying that the person had felt impressed that Captain Bates needed the money. Bates was overjoyed, and he quickly went to the store, and there he ordered a full barrel of flour along with a number of other grocery items. He asked the drayman to deliver it to his house and told him, "The woman of the house will probably tell you that those things don't belong here, but pay her no mind, I'll explain everything." A little while later, as Bates was working on his tract, his wife came up to him and said, "You will never believe what happened. There was a guy who came to our house and he dropped off all of this food, and I tried to tell him it didn't belong here, but he just left it anyway." Bates looked up and said, "Didn't I tell you that the Lord would provide?" She said, "Yeah, that's what you always say." And then he showed her the letter that had contained the very money that had been needed. And then Mrs. Bates went off for another cry. But this one, as the story goes, was of a very different character.
James White was encouraging ministers and others to come west. Joseph Bates wasn't in a big rush apparently to do that, but about 1858 he and Prudence moved from Massachusetts, first to Battle Creek for a couple of years, and then he came here to Monterey. The story is, I've never seen this in his handwriting or his printed articles, but it may be true, I have no reason to doubt it, that he really didn't want to settle in Battle Creek long term because he didn't want to be in the midst of all those Seventh-day Adventists. There's no evangelism to do if you're in the middle of Seventh-day Adventists, and Bates was an evangelist, so he wanted to be out here where there were some people that he could go visit. And he does continue visiting every year, almost up until his death in 1872 at the age of just a few weeks shy of being 80. Why, he's out doing evangelism, going for weeks or months sometimes at a time on these itinerant trips that he's traveling all over Michigan. But, well, the older he got, the less he traveled out of Michigan. I guess that stands to reason. Bates, because he was the oldest of those pioneers, having been born in 1792, James White not till 1821, Ellen White, of course, 1827, Uriah Smith, 32, etc. He was the one who was the presiding officer at early meetings, out of respect, probably for him, and the fact that he'd been a sea captain, so he had some knowledge about how to manage things like that. So anyway, he was the one that was presiding in 1860 when we chose the name Seventh-day Adventist. He presided the next year when the Michigan Conference, our first conference, was organized. Actually, the first session of the Michigan Conference was the following year, 1862, in the Monterey Church, which was just down the road here that we drove by. I meant to look to see if I could find some better pictures of the Monterey Church, and I didn't get it done, so please don't blame Josh, who was helping me with these pictures. So at the last minute, I grabbed a couple of pictures out of my own collection at home, which are fuzzy and all, but it gives you some idea of what the Monterey Church looked like. So this was the church that Joseph Bates pastored from when he came out here, and they got it built and all, until I guess shortly before his death, that he was listed as the pastor of the Monterey, Michigan Church. Now, Joseph Bates was a very independent fellow, as we talked about in Fairhaven with his travels and all. And he also was a health reformer. And as you know from our discussion earlier, he had given up a number of things through the years not because of any Ellen White vision, she hadn't had a vision yet, just because he found his system felt better when he didn't eat this or drink that or whatever. So he kept putting things aside. People began later in life to get worried about him as to whether he was starving himself. And so he wrote a letter to Ellen White a year or so, I think, before his death, anyway, fairly late in his life, listing all the stuff that he had in his house that he could eat. So he wanted her to know he wasn't starving. He was interesting also in that there was a rumor going around in the Adventist church. I know that surprises you, that a rumor goes around in the Adventist church. But there was a rumor going around that he had refused to offer the blessing at a potluck, a church potluck. You know, I should probably tell you, let's get the gospel started as a rumor in the Adventist church. It'll go around the world in 2 days, the work will be done, and we can go home, you know? And we like to have rumors. Anyway, if we could just get that rumor started. Anyway, but back to the story, seriously. So there was a rumor going around that he had refused to offer the blessing at a potluck that he had recently attended. And so it got bad enough, I guess, that he decided he needed to write to James and Ellen White and tell them what had really happened. So apparently what had happened was he was attending this potluck somewhere here in Michigan when they asked him to give the blessing. Now remember that even though Ellen White had had her health reform vision, it took our pioneers a little while to sort out the clean and unclean and all that kind of thing. But for Joseph Bates, there was no question. Pork, for instance, that was unclean. Didn't have to worry about it. So he looks out over the table and he sees some dishes, as he puts it in his letter to her, that have things in them that the Bible, God's word, I think is the way he phrased it, forbids us to eat. And so, without trying to make any fuss, he just asked the Lord to bless the healthy, wholesome, lawful food. And he left the unlawful food unblessed. And that got people kind of nervous about him and how he did things. Now, Joseph Bates was a very sincere man. He was a straight shooter. He was, when you saw Joseph Bates, that was what you really got. I found this in a footnote, which I think is kind of interesting, in Spaulding's Origin and History of Seventh-day Adventists, Volume 1. Sometimes you find some interesting stuff if you read the footnotes and not just the text. So I'm going to read this to you. It's just one paragraph, but it will give you another insight into Joseph Bates. All accounts and traditions concerning Elder Bates agree as to his benevolent attitude toward both men and women. Unlike some of his more jovial fellow workers, he never joked, but his genial speech and manners made him a most agreeable companion. In the matter of propriety, he stood so erect, some felt he leaned over backward. One time he visited the Stites family out in the country near Battle Creek, Michigan. Mr. Stites was ill. There were no sons in that family, but 2 daughters in their teens, the older of whom was Mary, my wife's mother, who told us the tale. When Elder Bates was to leave, the younger girl, Deborah, harnessed the horse to the buggy to take him to town. Courteously, he thanked her, but said, "My daughter, the Bible tells us to avoid the very appearance of evil. There are wagging tongues in the world, and a young woman must keep her name above reproach. Just now it is in my keeping, and I cannot allow you to drive me in." So despite their protests, he picked up his heavy satchel and footed it to town. It gives you some idea of Joseph Bates and his attitude about things.
The man whose adventures began as a cabin boy venturing out across the oceans, who became a sea captain and for years commanded his own vessel. A man who could never have dreamed that God's plans for his life could go so far beyond the immensity of the sea. The more he learned, the more Joseph Bates was transformed. But beyond the contributions that he made to the spiritual changes in the lives of others, this pioneer was a living example of the things he preached.
Well, late in life, just about a year before Bates died, there was a meeting held in the old Battle Creek church. and they were discussing the question of health reform. And several of the leaders of the church were describing their experience with health reform. Jane Andrews, James White, Joseph Bates. Well, Joseph Bates was able to report to them in his 79th year that he was entirely free from aches and pains. And whoever was writing this up said, nor did his looks belie his words, for at that very moment he stood as straight as a marble shaft and tripped about as lightly as a boy. The audience was so electrified by the aged man's eloquence that for a moment only deep amens were heard when he had finished with his testimony. Then they called Elder Andrews. Now, Elder Andrews was the exact opposite of Bates, as was James White. I can imagine James White must have been very jealous listening to Bates, because while Bates had no aches or pains at all at 79, at whatever James White would have been there, 54 or whatever at that time, he probably didn't have a day in his life when he didn't have aches and pains. And Andrews was not well either much of the time. So Elder Andrews was then called on to give his testimony about how the health message was impacting his life. And he started by saying, "What shall the man do who comes after the king?" Now, we have a university name for Jane Andrews, but he knew when it came to the topic of health reform, Bates, that was the man. So this is an interesting person here. He died, as I said, in 1872, just a few weeks short of his 80th birthday. He actually became ill. His wife had died a couple years earlier. So Joseph Bates is considered one of the co-founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. If you read George Knight, he thinks he's the real founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I mean, if you define it like George does, yeah, I'd agree. But I think the Lord knew exactly what he was doing. James White had talents that Bates didn't have. Ellen had a gift that neither Bates nor White had. Bates had some talents that that James White didn't have. I think the Lord knew he needed all three to get this movement going. And by utilizing the talents of all three, we have the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Joseph Bates was certainly a pioneer in the literal sense of the word. He spent his life pushing back frontiers. He pushed forward into temperance and health reform and continued to develop them throughout his life long before Adventists generally became involved. As a seeker for truth, he was continually searching for answers and ready to follow through when the answer came. As a missionary, he was constantly pushing into new areas that had not been evangelized, further south and west than any of our pioneers had gone to that point. His life begs the question, what can I do to advance the cause of Christ? In our next episode, we will examine the stories of 3 people who received the prophetic call in our movement's history and how they responded.